Well, I guess the common theme over that period of time is the increasing environmental constraints, the emergence of environmental constraints. When I started my career, people didn't think about the environment as something that mattered to the economy or to our lives particularly much. The issues were local and they were irritants, whereas I think today they are global and much more serious than they were then. And the obvious things are things like climate change. But even with climate change today, I don't think there's a recognition of what the impact that has. I think that the other thing is scarcities, emerging scarcities of land and food. We tend to have a belief that technology will solve all problems, and that belief is founded on a kind of a faith rather than an analysis of what the numbers are telling us. And so when we look at growth in agricultural output globally over the last part of the last century, it was largely driven by increases in yield because even then most of the available land was already being used. Other than that, that's protected and under forest. Whereas what we're looking at now is reductions in yield, and then on top of that we're going to overlay climate change. And people see these advances in technologies and they're published all the time, but what they don't do is put together the big picture numbers and work out what's happening on an aggregate global scale and what that means. Well, one way of measuring this is to calculate what they call an ecological footprint. And the ecological footprint essentially assumes that you keep everybody at the standard of living that they're experiencing, and you have a look at how much land is required to support those people at that standard of living. And if you do that calculation today, you get a number of about 1.4 or 1.5 Earths required to support the global population sustainably. If you go back to about 1980, it went through 1 Earth, and so we've been living unsustainably until then. If you then project forward to 2050, 2060, you get somewhere between 2 and some people say almost 3 Earths being required. And in the meantime, we've been operating beyond the sustainable level, which means that we've been depleting the environmental resource. So most of the ecosystems that support us are actually in decline. Food's the only major one that is still growing. And so the consequence of that is that can't continue forever. And so the change we're going to see is we're going to see what the economists in an economic circumstances call a correction. And you know, it's the form of that correction that lies ahead of us, and we need to make some decisions about how we will navigate that correction. But I don't think there's a very widespread understanding that that's where we're heading. It's easy to speculate, it's quite hard to predict. I guess that some people would say that it takes the form of a financial crisis. Another would say that it takes the form of an increase in the number of failed states as more and more states become unable to sustain themselves economically and financially, and the costs of the materials they use, particularly food, continues to rise, so people become marginalised, and obviously they then start to engage in various forms of conflict and migration, which causes disruption. So we're already seeing some of these effects, so that's a couple of ways that we will see it happen. I think the other thing that we'll see is we'll see an increasing division between those who are rich and those who are poor, the sort of building of fences that we're seeing, fences, walls, that we're seeing around the wealthier countries, and we're also seeing that start to emerge within countries between the rich and the poor. So potentially a kind of reversal of the sort of great equalisation that's taken place during the growth phase. I suppose there's a couple of layers of this. I mean, first of all, pretty obviously New Zealand's not operating in a sustainable way at the moment. Simply on climate change, for example, on our levels of material consumption, we're using far more than our share per capita. And so if we want to operate sustainably, we really have to transform our economies. But in terms of New Zealand's unique circumstances, we're somewhat remote. We have relatively abundant land, we have available water, we have a fairly benign climate, and the climate predictions are not as severe for New Zealand as they are perhaps for some other countries. And so New Zealand is becoming a more attractive place for people to go to, both as a safe haven and potentially as a place for investment. And so we're seeing those countries and individuals who are wealthy and looking for resource security and safety, moving either themselves or their investments or their options to New Zealand. And so we're going to probably benefit economically in the short run, but of course we won't be insulated from the issues that are arising in other countries in the medium term. And in the medium term, that means managing the risk around that, making sure that we've got the kinds of society and the kind of economy that isn't too severely disrupted by issues and difficulties that we might import from challenges that arise in other countries. There will be conflict as more and more people compete for fewer and fewer resources. Well, I guess there's some fundamental choices that need to be made. Are we all in this together, or are we looking after ourselves? And those choices need to be made at an individual level, a community level, a country level, and a global level. And it's really hard to see against a context of greed and growth and competition that we've had in the last few decades that's stimulated the economic growth, whether we'll be able to shift to the collaborative models that mean that we can navigate this together. And so you kind of have to think about how you hedge your bets. You do the best that you can to create collaborative solutions while protecting yourself against the possibility that those collaborative solutions may not work. But I think the biggest challenge in terms of leadership is actually kind of doing the analysis that helps you to understand what's going on. A lot of our political thinking, political economy, economic thinking, all of those things have been developed during the last couple of centuries when environmental constraints haven't been a particularly important feature of the world that we live in. And they exclude consideration even of the possibility of constraints becoming important. They essentially make an assumption that technology will solve all issues and capital and labour are the constraints. I think we're already seeing that that old world is starting to change, but we haven't really seen the implications of those changes being understood by the leadership who continue to look to growth and efficiency as the way out of our challenges. I happen to believe that that's not going to last. It will change. I don't know when it will change. Obviously, the sooner it changes, the more time we have to adapt ourselves to the emerging different circumstances. It's listening to the scientists. We haven't been listening to the scientists. We listen to the economists talk about science, and economists don't actually know much about science. And the other thing is, what we're seeing now is for the last 4 or 5 years, we're really seeing accelerating shifts in the climate, in the climate patterns. And so as people understand that we've actually triggered a change in the climate in the last few years, and then become more fearful about other changes, then we'll see more recognition. But by and large, the leaders tend to follow the public opinion, and until the public really understands it, the leaders won't follow. I think that there's an undeclared paradigm war going on in thinking, and that war is really between people who think that you can grow and develop technology and, in effect, continue to grow indefinitely, as the economic models actually tell you. And people have come to believe mathematical models, and others who believe that we have to navigate environmental constraints. And I think that's the fundamental debate that's taking place in the world today, and yet our political systems are still involved in a contest between capital and labour. If you look at our political parties, the leading political parties are still the parties of capital and the parties of labour. And the interesting thing about those two parties is that, and I'm talking globally here, in a lot of different countries, is that there are people's direct interests in play. So capitalists spend money to protect their position and change the rules to enhance the world to make them better off. Labour resists that and looks to protect the interests of labour. And so you've actually got population constituencies who look after those two interests, whereas there is not a population constituency. The animals and the life on the planet doesn't get a vote. The children who represent the future that's being traded away don't get a vote. And so we've kind of got an artifact of the old world, sort of fighting an old battle still, when the game's changed, and we haven't recognised that yet. What has happened so far is that as green parties have grown and gained more influence, the other parties have taken their policies. And so if you talk with a green politician about that, they'll say, well, I'm happy because I get the policy changed. And yes, I guess that's a small win, but it actually doesn't change the paradigm. And so, it's a step in the right direction. It gets more people understanding the importance of these things, but until there's a sufficient constituency of people who understand it, they won't be strong enough to cause real change in the leadership. And leaders want to get themselves elected and re-elected, and unless the public understands that, is well informed, is motivated, we're not going to see the changes that will protect our future. Yeah, I almost think it's not so much about whether it's a democratic system or a more managed state system. It's really whose interests are you operating in. And I guess in the democratic system, we've kind of aligned the idea of freedom with the idea of sort of economic freedom with the idea of business freedom to pursue what matters to business. And so we pursue GDP growth. Now, the only thing that GDP growth is really strongly aligned with is the profit potential for business in the aggregate. And so what we're running Western societies in the interests of business. And in the past, those interests have been aligned with the interests of individuals. That is increasingly not true, but we're still pushing in that direction. Whereas other countries that are more centrally managed can have a more balanced approach. I've been surprised when China has deliberately reduced its growth rate. It's in the 5-year plan. They said they're reducing their growth rate in order to protect their environment. And yet the Western commentators lament the fact that their economy has been faltering, because that's the lens that they look at it through. So what emerges in the future depends on what we do. So our ideas drive our behaviour, and our behaviour determines what happens. And what happens influences our ideas. And so the history is an unfolding of that co-evolution of ideas and behaviour and history. And if we change our ideas, then we influence that co-evolution and we influence our future. So the most important thing in determining the future that we will have is the way that we think about things.